Welcome back, my friends, to the AA Recovery Interviews podcast. I'm your host, Howard L., and I'm an alcoholic. Sober since January 1st, 1988, one day at a time. I'm grateful you've joined us. AA Recovery Interviews is the podcast where Alcoholics Anonymous members from around the world share their extraordinary stories of experience, strength, and hope. My interview on this episode of AA Recovery Interviews is with Corby M., whose experience in AA started in 2017, only to be sidetracked by a relapse in 2020. Fortunately, he survived that slip and was able to claim a new sobriety date 2 years ago. Corby's relapse story is one that's grown more common these days as the prescribed use of opioids for legitimate pain turns into misuse and then addiction. In Corby's case, intense back pain and the ensuing abuse of painkillers led him back to alcohol, despite all he'd been doing in AA. By the time he made it back to the fellowship after inpatient treatment, he had been whipsawed by the voracity of the disease. Clawing his way back into the middle of the program, he redoubled his commitment to stay sober and established new lines of accountability to both his sponsor and those he was closest to in AA. With a renewed spirit of service to AA, he became more active than ever in his club and offered both newcomers and those who'd relapsed his hard-won experience and growing wisdom. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to see Corby in a few meetings each week and observe firsthand the very real change that has come to him as the result of earnestly working the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. His involvement in the fellowship extends well beyond the conclusion of each meeting. I often see him sticking around to chat with newcomers and old-timers alike, with his affable manner that everyone loves. Corby's story will resonate with anyone who has turned to alcohol for respite from doubt, uncertainty, and fear. That he survived his disease's attempt to permanently take him out of pain and misery is strong evidence for the efficacy of the AA program. That he now lives each day to stay sober and help others demonstrates the transformation that can occur as the result of doing the hard work the program requires. I believe you'll find Corby's story to be both engaging and informative. His is a message that we alcoholics need to hear over and over again. So settle in for the next 65 minutes of this episode of AA Recovery Interviews with my friend and AA brother, Corby M.
My name is Corby, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Corby. I'm so glad you could be on the AA Recovery Interviews podcast with me today.
I'm happy to be here, Howard.
Yeah, what was great was I just had the opportunity to hear you share in the meeting, in the step study meeting that we have in the next room over there. Mm-hmm. And it was on the 8th step today.
Yeah.
And you had a lot of really interesting things to say about that. You're sober for how long?
2 years.
2 years?
Yeah.
What's your sobriety date?
It's actually 9/8/20. It'll be on the 8th, it'll be 2 years.
It seems like more time has passed, less than 2 years.
Well, yeah, so my original sobriety date was in November of 2017.
Okay, that's right. You have been here for about 6 years,
yeah,
right?
That's right.
So what was going on in November of 2017 that brought you into AA?
I'd been at this point in my life where I was just managing, drinking. I would say sort of recreationally, but I definitely had my times where, I had way too much and, had a hard time getting home and, I was a blackout drunk. And had tried to sort of quit, numerous times in the previous, in the preceding, I would say like 10 years, I'd had a bunch of times where I would stop and with no recovery, I would just stop, and I would just say, hey, whenever I drink, usually good things don't happen. So I'm going to try to not drink, and so I would go for periods of, a month or 3 months or, I think the longest I went was 6 months maybe. And then I would try to do what the book says. I would try to just drink beer or, just drink on the weekends or just drink when I was out or just drink at home. I tried them all, and then I began to have times where, when I was drinking towards the end and in that year of 2017 in November, the incidences of me, drinking too much and then either passing out or, offending somebody, in a gross way, were increasing. Just like the book says, I would wake up and I'd feel remorse and I would vow to never do that again. And then a few weeks would go by and somehow, I would do it again. And so I started, every time that happened, I just kind of felt so much shame and guilt about it. I couldn't figure out why I couldn't stop. I'm not sure that I ever believed that alcohol was my problem.
So you were able to put together the connection with what your behavior turned into when you were drinking and the consequences of that behavior. You were able to create some kind of causality there. So you knew what was causing A was causing B to happen, but yet what was missing from that equation?
I think I would just say, awareness. Because as we say a lot in the rooms, life began to happen and it wasn't going my way. Stresses were happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I was finding myself drinking, sort of trying to control my drinking just sort of at times throughout the evenings, and I was just hiding. I was hiding, emotionally and mentally hiding. I would look in the mirror and just be like, man, I don't like what I see. And I would go take a drink. Whatever I was feeling inside, I wanted to not feel it.
Was that a pattern that had gotten started earlier in your life?
Yeah, it really was.
When did you have your first drink?
I went to a Catholic grade school, and I remember somehow, when we would have PE, we would have access to the church.
Yeah.
And they serve wine at a Catholic church, Catholic mass, and I stole a bottle of wine from church.
When you were just a kid, huh?
Yeah, I was like in 7th grade, 6th or 7th grade. It was a big old, it was a jug. I mean, I don't know how many liters, it was a lot of wine. And so I stole it and then put it in my bag, somehow got it home without my parents, having any idea, and invited 2 of my friends over, and, they came over and we, drank it. And it was interesting because I was the only one that didn't pass out and get sick. Which again, I don't know that that's just luck or, whatever, but.
So you got drunk from it?
Yeah.
Do you remember hilarious behavior or any?
Yeah, I remember running around just kind of crazy, acting foolish. I remember feeling like I like this. I like the way this feels. And I felt this sense of coolness, not in the Hollywood sense, but in the true sense. And I felt this coolness in my body when I drank, and I really enjoyed it.
Was that feeling something that you had been seeking earlier before you had that episode with the wine? Going back into, let's say, your family of origin and your childhood, what was going on in that environment that may have made you seek out this sense of coolness?
I come from a stable home. My parents have been married for 50 years. And I can't really think of anything specific. I was diagnosed with having some learning disabilities when I was younger. And I just remember always feeling unable, to do certain things in school. And I always just sort of felt like I was at a deficit, when I was in school. And, I certainly had behavior problems associated with that. I had a hard time sitting still in class. I got kicked out of class a lot. Yeah, I just remember feeling like, in that respect, I just didn't fit in. My friends studied, and did well in school, and I just sort of showed up. And, I remember at times showing up and going, oh, is there a test today? Because I just had no awareness of it. And I think my parents just thought, well, he's just not a good student, or he has, whatever learning disabilities. I know that I got tested and I know I had ADD, but I'm not sure if there were other things associated with that.
And how did your parents react to that? Did they just let you be with it, or did they seek out help with that? What was their response?
I remember going to, various facilities, I guess, if you will, to get tested. And I don't ever remember there being like a here's what's going on diagnosis. So I just kind of always felt like there's something wrong with me.
When did you first start feeling that way?
Probably from, like middle school.
What was home life like? Is there alcoholism or within your family?
Yeah, I mean, certainly not in my immediate family. My parents drank, and they definitely drank when I was growing up, but never to excess. We had alcohol around in my house. There's certainly mental illness in my extended family, something I've experienced, personally. So, it's interesting as I look back now, I wonder if depression wasn't a significant part of what I was, experiencing, as a middle schooler, and high schooler. I would just get really attached to people, specifically girls, and, I really I fell in love with this concept. A lot of the stuff that you like see in movies, I romanticized my life, and if there was ever a breakup or anything, I mean, like I remember being, 16, 17 years old and getting a bottle of tequila and locking my door in my house, as a 17-year-old and drinking tequila by myself, for the sole purposes of drowning out the pain that I was feeling. And I put myself in a lot of those situations with girls and just with relationships, where I was so attached, so dependent.
Or codependent, as they call it these days, right?
For sure, yeah. I just remember drinking so that the pain would go away and I could, stop feeling it.
So you started drinking, let's say, when you were about, with the wine and everything else. Did you continue drinking after that?
Yeah.
So you started drinking at, 13, 14 years old, which is very common amongst almost all my guests that I've interviewed. Is 13, 14, 15 seems to be the magic numbers in there. But were you aware when you were going into these relationships, whether it was just dating or whatever it was, romanticizing, that if it didn't work out, you could always drink?
Yeah, it's almost as if I looked forward to it in some way.
Like it not working out?
Yeah, like I knew there was going to be, some big fallout, at least, from my standpoint.
Yeah.
And that I was going to get to, lick my wounds, as they say. And
That's interesting. You mentioned it in a way that made me think of the kind of the dramatic element in there. And, the movies and in TV shows where the guy loses the girl and then you see him at a bar or you see him in his room or whatever else, obliterating whatever the feelings are.
Sure. That was something I identified with really early on, and I remember just going, that's what I'm attracted to. That image, which really that image was a reflection of what I wanted to experience.
Yeah.
Because I was never really a good time Charlie.
Yeah.
I drank, and I had a lot of good guy friends and I was in a fraternity, and, so I did all of the traditional hell raising and beer drinking, as they say. But in terms of how I saw myself, I really identified with that image of the guy you're talking about, sitting on a bar stool with a bottle of, Jack Daniels and, gone dead to the world.
Yeah. Beautiful loser. That, the guy who you don't so much as feel sorry for him as feel envious.
It's a very immature view, as I understand it, now, and I can look back now and go, something happened to me in my youth where I stopped developing emotionally.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's usually the case. We hit some point at which all growth beyond that point stops. And of course, the teenage mind, the brain doesn't fully develop until somewhere in the 20s. So if you're doing that to your body and brain at 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, it's easy to see where that behavior kind of becomes locked in when you're doing it. You mentioned the girls, and you were dating a lot in high school.
I wouldn't say it was the high frequency, but I had significant relationships.
Okay.
And they were, corny and the kind of stuff that, like I said, like you see in the movies, where it was like I thought I was going to be with them forever, kind of thing.
Yeah. How did alcohol and drugs? Were you doing drugs as well, or just alcohol?
I was doing drugs, off and on.
So how did alcohol play into those relationships? Was it a part of them, or was it excluded from them? How did that work out?
It's interesting. It was excluded as it relates to what I would call the severe image of my alcoholism.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely drank, and drinking was part of my relationships, but I didn't drink alcoholically in the relationship.
Did the girls? Were they sharing in that with you?
Yeah, I don't remember anything in particular related to that.
The reason I asked is because when I was in high school, my junior and senior year, I had a steady girlfriend for about 2 years, and we were really in love. I mean, it was big. But she just didn't like guys who drank at all. Mm. And so whatever it was I was going to be doing with drinking was completely suspended for the length of our relationship.
Oh, wow. Which
was very interesting.
Yeah.
I used to kind of play that against what my friends were doing. They had all these unstable relationships, but they seemed to be having a wilder time than I was having. Mm. So whenever it was that we went to college, at the same college together, the relationship fell apart because all of the opportunities that college created for me to go wild and be able to date and that sort of thing, we broke up right after we started going to college together as a result of that.
Oh, wow.
But she was the predominant reason why I didn't drink during my junior and senior years in high school. Mm. Now, you were drinking, you were hanging with the crowd.
Yeah, I mean, the same guys that I was stealing wine with in 7th and 8th grade, I went to high school with, and I remember stealing alcohol from liquor stores, and I remember getting arrested in 8th grade. Yeah, I mean, we just sort of didn't have any regard for really much of anything, And it's like I can look back on my life and almost without exception say, from high school through college and through my adult life, the situations where they've ended in a bad way, negative way, whether it's wetting the bed or getting arrested, it was always because I was drinking or using. None of the bad things ever happened when I was stone cold sober, like I am sitting here with you. I don't remember having nights where I went out and drank and I just was like, man, that was so much fun tonight. I'm really glad I did that.
Huh.
It just generally didn't end well.
So there was a point at which during the evening that you felt okay and then it went downhill?
Yeah, I couldn't stop.
Did you ever have an idea where that point was and try to stop at that point?
Sure. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's sort of a passing thought, and as you and I both know, as I know now, your judgments and your ability to make good judgments, is diminished once you start drinking and drugging. And so it's a really tough ask to be able to manage, to figure out where's that number of drinks is too much.
Yeah. We try to get to that point and we always overshoot it. And by that point, what used to happen for me was I'd overshoot it and I'd think, what the hell, I'm already beyond that point, so I might as well drink anyhow.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, with the guys you were hanging with, what kind of crowd was that?
We were all mostly jocks. We all played football. And so we mostly just played sports and, hung out with girls and
the popular guys at school.
I would say, I don't remember there being that being a big factor, but, I did excel to the degree that I excelled in anything as a kid. I did excel in athletics, certainly relative to, my school activities.
Did that kind of make up for the deficits in the academics?
Sure, yeah. I definitely felt like I had a place, in the world, as a result of that. Mm-hmm. I had a place in the hierarchy of the environment. High school, I don't think was anything, there was anything significant, but I definitely drank alcoholically. I got arrested a few times. I cheated in school, mm-hmm. I didn't take it seriously. There was nothing serious about my life other than maybe, football I took seriously.
Mm-hmm. So you were hanging with this crowd during high school. You got through high school. What was next?
Well, then I went to college, sort of limped my way through the first couple of years, mm-hmm. Didn't do particularly well. I don't remember what happened, but at some point I decided to take some ownership of my mental health, the learning aspects of, who I was. And so I went to see a doctor, and I was diagnosed with, having ADD, and at that point, subsequently began taking medication, mm-hmm. and it ended up, my last 2 years of college doing really well, which was just amazing, to me, that it was something that would help, that much. I took medication, for that. That was the main treatment.
So a number of people I've interviewed, Adderall and whatever else they were giving for ADD mm-hmm. at the time, did some miraculous things for them in terms of academics or just their social relationships or whatever. But on top of that, they continued to drink and do what they were doing with marijuana or other drugs. Were you continuing to drink while you were also taking the medications?
Yeah, I never looked at it as an impediment to anything I was doing on that front. Mm-hmm. Whether it was smoking or, certainly drinking. All those things I looked at as being separate compartments.
Yeah. Compartmentalization is an important thing to be able to do if you're going to live with all the conflicts going on, isn't it?
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's a great skill. It's a requirement if you're going to live the way I lived for most of my life.
Now, during this time in college, was this also a time at which you had relationships with the girls?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's when I met my wife, and in my relationship with her, she was taking life seriously. I mean, she was very social, and she was in a sorority, and she went to class, and she studied for her exams, and had plans for a future. And I think I sort of looked at her and thought, well, number one, I'm madly in love with this person, and I think I want to spend the rest of my life with her. That was something I identified really, as probably I was 19 or 20 years old probably. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I better get it together to the degree that, I want to stay with her, And I mean, it was nothing, I never felt like she was like forcing my hand. I think I was able to just sort of see her as an example, and I think I looked around and saw, I need to start taking life seriously, because it is something to be taken seriously.
So what did that look like?
Well, it looked like, spending more time away from the fraternity. I spent a lot of time with her, and then it looked like me taking some initiative to go to the doctor. I think I'd been kind of saying, well, my parents did some research around this, and they really couldn't figure anything out. So, it is what it is. I really don't remember what specifically happened, but I do. Something happened that made me go, you know what, I'm going to go see if I can uncover what's going on. Now that I'm older and I can hear it for myself.
So in a lot of ways, her presence in your life helped you straighten out to the extent that you were able to go and get help for the ADD.
Yeah, it really did.
Yeah, that's great. That's a real gift in and of itself, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So did you start dating her exclusively at that point, or?
Yeah, we started dating exclusively at that point. Yeah.
So like from then to now?
From then to now, yeah.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah, it's been almost 30 years.
Wow. Yeah, and I want to ask about those 30 years. As we move on from college, did you have a plan for moving forward? Did you know what it was you wanted to do when you get out?
I basically thought I was going to go be a salesman. And that's sort of all I sort of had pigeonholed myself that thinking, this is really all I can do. I think I can do this. I can talk to people.
Yeah.
And I'm halfway intelligent. I can do this, you know? And so I always just assumed that's what I was going to do, you know? And I graduated from college and began, that's what I started. That's what I did. I was a salesman. And that's what I do today. I'm still a salesman. What
were your early years in sales like? Because sales is a profession that is absolutely rife with alcoholism.
I do remember in college, psychology was my major. And I remember thinking, this is going to help me learn to read people. And I do remember, you know, feeling able when I graduated. I do remember feeling able because of that, you know, because I felt like I knew how to talk to people and I knew how to read people. And I feel like that's one of the strength that I have today that I feel like, you know, and for the most part served me well. And yeah, I mean, drinking, you know, we drank, you know, every night, you know, when we worked, and every day we went to the bar pretty much, you know, for a happy hour, you know, there was always something. And I remember going to meet clients for drinks and, you know, it was always part of it.
Yeah. When you gave thought to stopping drinking later on, whenever it was, did you consider how important the drinking was to the profession? Did that enter into your decisions at all?
No, it didn't, unfortunately, because I had been doing it long enough that I had, you know, I had enough of a foothold on the business that I could afford to not go to happy hours or not, you know, have cocktails or dinner with clients, you know.
Do you think you would have been successful stopping drinking earlier in that environment?
It would have been really hard, knowing now that I have, you know, because I know now that I had undiagnosed depression for many of those years as well. Yeah, it was a struggle.
How long after school did you guys get married, and what were the early years of the marriage like for you while you were, I'm assuming, still drinking?
Yeah, sure.
At that time?
We got married, you know, within 4 or 5 years of me graduating, maybe less than that, 3 years probably. And, you know, we started having a family, you know, pretty early. The first years of our marriage was really just focused on raising our kids. We have 4 kids. They're within, you know, 15 months of each other, you know, all 4 of them. So it was just like 1, 2, 3, 4. And so the early part of our marriage really was all about that.
How did alcohol enter into that, or were you drinking as much or not as much? Did you have an intent to not drink because of that? What was the feeling there?
Yeah, I mean, I really, it was something I didn't think about it. As you know, as we know, alcoholism is progressive, and at the time, you know, it was just in its normal progression. So, you know, I was drinking, you know, socially, and my wife and I would go out and we'd go to a ball game, or, you know, we would go to dinner, and, you know, I could have a few drinks, and, you know, the behavior associated with the drinking wasn't severe at that point.
So looking back at those years in your marriage and in the raising of your family and in the formative years and the early growth years of your career, is it safe to say it was truly social drinking, or was that still looming in the background, the alcoholism?
The alcoholism, as we know it, was always there. There was always a feeling, there was always something inside of me that I was trying to fill up with something, whether it was work or, you know, accolades or achievements or money or, you know, my children's achievements. Or, you know, I just sort of always had this image of myself that I had to be a certain way in life.
Were you accomplishing that?
You know, the short answer is I didn't see any of that happening. You know, you could argue that yes, there definitely I had success in my life. You know,
Yeah.
without question, I had success in my life in the traditional sense. You know, my kids were all, you know, did well in school, and, you know, are just good, solid people. And but deep down, you know, I always had this feeling of, you know, something's off.
Yeah. Well, the depression, I know in my case, the depression will do that to me, that no matter how good things were going, they never felt like they were going good. Or at times at which I thought, all this great stuff is going on and I still feel like blah. you know? Mm-hmm. It's a weird way to feel. I always wondered, what's wrong with me that I can't feel more elation at the success in my life? Why does it feel like something's missing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And it definitely, it's been my experience.
Has it?
You know, being a 12-step program has really helped my depression as well. You know, I have traditional treatment for that, as you know, but you know, understand, you know, the spiritual aspect of the program. You know, I would just say when I came into the program in 2017, the images and the view I had of the world, myself, and then myself in relation to the world, and then how I viewed myself just directly, was very sick, which I believe is where the alcoholism, you know, kind of has always been.
So there's this period of time between having the 4 kids, drinking, let's say responsibly or functionally, growing your career, that sort of thing. At what point did things start to go downhill as a result of the alcohol?
So it was, you know, specifically, you know, around 2015 to 2017 is when these incidences of drinking in excess started happening more often. Life became unmanageable.
In what ways?
Well, I wasn't able to live as an adult. I couldn't face life. I couldn't handle life.
What did that look like in terms of your job and your relationship with your family?
Yeah, I mean, it looked like not following through on my commitments. Mm-hmm. You know, it looked like lying. It looked like, you know, cheating and stealing. It just looked like I said, I think when we started, it looked like I just was hiding out, you know, not facing reality.
Was that called to your attention by anybody around you, the people you worked with, your spouse, your family, your parents?
I mean, yeah, definitely, you know, it was something that I was in therapy about, and, you know, my wife and I had been in couples therapy some about it, and it was sort of like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know what's wrong. I don't understand what's wrong.
You couldn't see the linkage between the alcohol and what was wrong?
At some point, at this particular time, I still was thinking, I don't know why I keep drinking like that. Mm-hmm. And because I'm, you know, when I'm not like that, I'll go through life and I do the best I can, but I'm not happy with myself or with life, and I don't want to be here. Mm-hmm. I hear people say this a lot, and it's an old saying, I guess, if you will, that alcohol was my solution to dealing with life and the feelings that I had associated with life. You know, these incidences of, you know, drinking too much, and, you know, whether it was, you know, I'd wake up I'd be passed out on the back porch, or passed out in my car, or passed out downstairs, or, you know, I would do something where I didn't remember what happened. I'd wake up and kind of go, what happened last night?
So you were getting to be a blackout drinker?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I couldn't stop. I didn't know how to stop. Once I started, you know, I couldn't stop.
We'll be right back. My friends, if you're enjoying AA Recovery interviews, I invite you to check out my latest audiobook, Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how more than 100 men have recovered from alcoholism. This is the word-for-word, cover-to-cover reading of the first edition of the Big Book, published in 1939. It's a relaxing yet meaningful and engaging way to listen to the Big Book anytime, any place. Have a free listen at Audible, iTunes, or Amazon. While you're there, search for my other audiobook, Lost Stories of the Big Book, 30 original stories from the first and or second editions, missing from the third and fourth editions of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's an engaging audiobook that brings these stories to life for AA members who've never seen them. These timeless testimonials were originally cut to make room for newer stories in the third and fourth editions. But their vitally important messages of hope are as meaningful today as they were when they were first published. Many listeners will hear these stories for the very first time. It's also available from Amazon as a Kindle book or in paperback if you'd like to read along. You're going to love it. And we're back. You mentioned 2015, which is a couple years before you first came in, but it sounds like there were quite a few years in there where you must have been a functional alcoholic.
Yeah, I just sort of white knuckled it.
Did you?
Yeah. I mean, there was nothing, I don't remember anything specifically. I think I just kept saying, I'm going to take a break from alcohol for a period. And, then I'd start trying to go to a Bible study or try to start going to church or, and those things, like we say as well, like those things worked, until they didn't work. And so the feeling of uselessness and self-pity kept growing inside of me, even though I was doing, these things to make the pain go away. And really the pain was this image I have of myself is unrealistic. This concept of humility was not one that I understood, at all. And I remember leading into that last sort of what caused me to come into the program. And I'd been exposed to it a little bit. I'd been to a few meetings in my life, but I remember going to meetings and some of the same meetings that where I see you now,
sure.
and going, these guys are all here because they're trying to learn how to control their drinking. I just didn't understand the concept of the 12 steps or recovery, sobriety. I just didn't understand, at least what I understand, today.
How long did you hold to that erroneous belief when you were first going into AA in 2017?
Gosh, well, I didn't have it in 2017, but before that, I'd been to some meetings.
Okay, so that's when you were thinking about it.
Yeah, and that's when I was thinking about, like, these guys are, I just remember thinking, I'm glad I'm not them. I'm glad I'm not as bad off as a lot of these guys are. So I think back and I can say I had a spiritual experience sometime in 2017.
What did that look like?
Well, it looked like I was going to watch my son play football, and I ended up drinking at my office and by myself. Ended up going home and picking up my other kids and picking up two of their friends, and I'd been drinking, not all day, but enough, that I was certainly intoxicated. And anyway, I drove them to this game, basically blacked out, and I dropped them off, and then I went home and I just left them there with my wife, and my family were there, and I just left them and went home and sort of just kind of just disappeared. I didn't tell them anything. They got out of the car and I just drove off and I was at home. And the next day I was going on a trip with one of my sons the next day, and I remember I woke up feeling just so much shame because I missed my son's game, and my family was, scared to death of what had happened to me that night. And I just remember the feeling of, complete and utter demoralization. I was totally hopeless. I ended up going out of town with my son that day to go, and we went with some other people. And I remember I didn't drink that day, and I got there. We were going out of town, out into the country, and I just remember at one point I kind of snuck off and went by myself, and I went, I was out in this field, and I remember being in my car, and I had a pistol in my car, and I remember just thinking, I can't do this.
Can't do what? The living or the dying?
I can't live anymore like this. And I just remember feeling total hopelessness. And I had a bottle of alcohol in the car that I hadn't touched yet. It was about 24 hours, maybe not even that long since my last drink. Well, let me back up a little bit. I woke up that morning, before this being in the field situation. I woke up that morning thinking, okay, I know that I'm drinking because I'm hurting.
Right.
So I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to drink anymore.
Yeah.
And I got to figure out what's going on with me, to figure out why I'm hurting so bad. I'd identified at that point enough to know I was mature enough to understand that I was distracting myself by working or exercising or, drinking to fill some hole that I had inside. So I knew that. So I just kind of said, all right, I'm not going to drink. So I'm in this field, and I think, I'm going to end it. I can't do this anymore. I'm done. And I picked up the pistol and I put it in my mouth. And I got a call from another friend of mine who's not in the program, but he's in another 12-step program. And he knew about what happened because he was was close to my family or is close to my family. And I answered the phone, and I didn't tell him what I was doing, but I remember I was crying. I just remember him saying, "Corby, I know this hurts, and I know you don't believe me, but you're going to be okay. And you just got to get through the day. You just got to get through the day."
So this call comes in while you have the barrel of the revolver in your mouth.
Yeah.
What made you answer it? I think, it's one of the things that I've come to appreciate about the program, that God shows up for me through other people. So I believe that was God showing up for me in that moment. And I think I knew that he would understand. When my phone rang, I think I knew there was a part of me that wanted to keep going. Yeah.
So, I kind of just white-knuckled it through the weekend. I came home. My kids were still pretty young, but they knew something was going on for sure, And my wife was obviously very hurt and scared and sad. And
had you said anything to her about the episode in the car with the gun?
No.
No. Okay.
No. That was something that I still kept very secret.
I get it. Yeah.
I didn't want anyone to know about that.
Okay.
And I just thought, I just remember thinking, what is wrong with me? What is wrong with me? So I came home a couple of days later, and I didn't drink at all. And I just sort of tried to grind through the weekend as best I could, and then I went to an AA meeting when I got back. And then for some reason, I reached out to someone who's in the program that that you and I both know.
Yeah.
And he was a client, and I didn't have any real reason to reach out to him. I knew he was in the program, but I reached out to him, and I think I just left him a very sort of generic message, and he called me back the same day, and I could tell when he started talking to me that he knew what was going on.
Yeah.
And I don't know how he knew, he didn't have any reason to know. I knew that he knew he wasn't calling me because he was going to talk about some business element. I mean, he knew it was a personal call.
So you didn't leave, in the message that you left for him to call back, you didn't say anything except give me a call back?
Yeah.
Wow.
This guy ended up being my sponsor.
Yeah.
Ultimately, and so I just I got in the program. I started working the program pretty much from day one.
Yeah.
At that point.
Yeah.
And thinking, okay, I don't know if this is the right place for me. I don't know if I have alcoholism or not.
Yeah.
But I know I can't drink or drug, and so I'm gonna stick with this program and try it out. He had me read some of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he said, I want you to go through, and there was an exercise that he wanted me to do, and I just remember reading it the first time and thinking, man, this is me. I'm reading a book about myself.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. And I remember telling him that, and he goes, yeah, you know why you feel that? And I said, no. He goes, because you're an alcoholic. And I remember kind of laughing, but.
Was that a revelation to you when you realized that? I mean, or had you already been thinking that was you anyway?
I really hadn't, I knew that I drank, what I would call alcoholically, and I knew I was a problem drinker, but I remember when he said that, and I had this sort of spiritual experience in that moment.
Yeah.
Wow, this is a solution.
Wow.
This is a solution.
How long after you coming into this second revelation or this moment of clarity? I mean, to me, it seems like the first God moment was in the car with that gun, and the call comes in.
Yeah.
This sounds like the follow-up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true, and it made me.
Was that immediate? I mean, was that very early, the first few days that you were there? Or?
It was probably within the first 30 days of my sobriety, yeah. And I just remember once I identified that, I remember thinking, man, I'm on fire for this AA stuff now. And I remember going to meetings, and I wanted to go, and I found a home group and started meeting people, and I remember thinking, and the big book talks about us, being on a great liner.
Uh-huh.
And I remember thinking, when I walked into an AA room, at some point in my first, I don't know, maybe it was 90 days, but in the first period, I remember walking in and thinking, I've been saved from the hopeless state of mind and body.
So this is within the first few months you're feeling that way.
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, it was really cool.
I got to be in some of those meetings with you. In fact, I think I remember some of the very first meetings you went to at that club, and you could definitely see a man who, there was a certain tentative nature about you, but you also seemed determined. So, it's always tough to tell by just looking at a guy coming in a few times whether he really has it or not. The thing I do remember you doing, though, was you stuck around after the meetings.
Yeah.
Do you remember doing that?
Sure. And it was really just sort of leaning into the program. My sponsor had a pretty big event in his life, and I remember, trying to be there for him as best I could. And I would have never done that before I came into the program.
It was amazing to watch you do that, by the way. I got a chance to witness a man being of extraordinary service to another AA early in his program. This absolutely cataclysmic event goes on with this man who we know, and you were there. You were like there every step of the way for him, and it was a beautiful thing to watch. As tough as it was for you to do, I'm sure seeing you and getting to witness you doing that was really big for me and other people in that room. It almost was like you were a natural or something.
Well, I don't know about all that. I feel like I say this a lot in meetings, that I feel like God shows up for me through people. I didn't consciously, because back then I didn't think of it that way. When I was there for him, I just was thinking, this just feels like what's right. And it's amazing that I look at that time now and I think that time really prepared me for my life. Showing up in a stressful situation like that, sad, kind of devastating situation for someone else, allowed me to show up for people in my life and to not make it about me.
That's a great evolution for an alcoholic, to get to the point of it being all about me to it not being about me. That's a big, big step to take. So this happens in 2017, 2018. Take us up to the point of your slip.
Yeah, so things were going well. My life was good. My relationships were on the mend at home. I was just engrossed in the program. Went to 7 or 8 meetings a week. Definitely worked the steps, and I was in the deal. I was doing the deal for sure. But I've had back problems for a long time, and I've had 2 surgeries on my back when I was younger. Both are injuries from playing sports. And so this pain came back over the last, 3 to 4 years. And it became clear that I was going to have my back fused. I guess it was 2019.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the surgery and the pain was bad. The pain wasn't getting any better. And at some point, I started taking medication. I was going to a doctor and I was being treated, and, he gave me pain medication. I don't think it's a unique story. As I look back now, he gave me the medication. I took it as prescribed. At some point, I began prescribing them myself. And then I had the surgery thinking, okay, once the surgery happens, I'm going to be pain-free. Because I was having a hard time sleeping, and it was really affecting my life.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
And I had the surgery. The pain didn't go away, so I kind of kept taking this medication. I think the unique thing is I never stopped going to meetings during this time period. I was still involved in my club and still chairing meetings and leading meetings. And, I was thinking in my head, well, I'm not taking this medication to get loaded, because if that was the truth, I had significant pain.
Yeah.
And that's why I was taking the medication. My brain tricked me, and I told myself what I needed to hear to allow myself to say, I'm in the program. What do you mean? I'm sober. It didn't even occur to me. I never one time had a moment of going, well, is this really a good idea? Yeah, I just thought, I'm in this pain, and I did make a decision at some point where I just said, I can't live in pain like this anymore. It was not a good situation. So I just kind of said, I'm going to take the meds until the pain gets better. I was doing rehab, so I was doing all the things, PT and such, that they were telling me to do. It just wasn't getting better. And so what happened was, thank God, as I've come to find out, it becomes harder to get medication the more you take.
Yeah.
Because at some point the doctors go, I'm not giving you any more meds,
Yeah, they're gone too quick.
Too quick, yeah. Like, I somehow didn't have the idea to go, well, I'm just going to go get them on the street. I didn't think about that. That never occurred to me, thank God. So I just said, okay, I'm going to say that this is a sign that I got to stop. And I stopped taking the meds, kind of cold turkey. And then that very next night, I was in so much pain that I drank, physical pain, and I had access to alcohol in my house, and I drank. And I drank for 3 straight days, not literally, but I drank for 3 consecutive days, to the point of passing out. And on the 5th day, I went to treatment. Yeah, I thank God, my wife, it was a very tumultuous end again. I ended up, breaking things and passing out in the bed and hurting myself. And
how long had you been sober by this point?
About 3 years.
About 3 years,
yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So, it was instantaneous in terms of how much I took of alcohol. I woke up one day, that last day after a horrible night, my wife was like, okay, what's going on? She didn't say it quite that calmly, but she just said, well, what's going on? And I told her the truth. I said I drank. And she, somehow said, look, I'm not telling you have to go to treatment, but I'm telling you have to go to treatment.
Yeah, I get that.
Because I don't think, she said, I don't think you can do this on your own. She was right. I still didn't realize at that time. I've come to understand now, because I've studied it, this concept of hyperalgesia, which is, I thought was just, I didn't think it was a real thing, and it's intuitive, but effectively it's the more you take pain meds, the worse your pain is going to be. And so at some place when I was taking medication, I crossed over this threshold where
it stopped relieving the pain and started causing the pain.
Yeah, and if I needed 2 to get me to the same place, comfort level before, now I need 5. And it ramps up very quickly. It goes from 2 to 12, like almost overnight.
Had you talked to your sponsor or anybody else about this as it was going on with the meds?
No. I did talk to a few people in the program, but I wasn't honest with them that I was self-prescribing. They would say, take, it would say take, 2 every 3 hours.
Yeah.
And I would take 3 every 2 hours.
Yeah, that's classic.
Yeah, classic. And then I would say, I'm just going to store them up and take them all at once at night so I can go to bed, so I can sleep. Yeah, I mean, I was sick. And one thing I learned, I read this in the book a million times, but, the big book talks about insanity returns. And man, I didn't understand what that meant until this happened in my life. And I started going, wow, the insanity's returned.
So were you out of meds when you took that first drink after? Okay, so you're out of meds. You had no relief.
No relief, yeah.
So alcohol looks like the perfect solution.
Yeah.
So once she said what she said to you, were you ready to go to treatment?
I had so much fear, first of all. And I felt so much shame, from, ruining my sobriety, if you will. And that I just said, I'm going to go.
How long were you in treatment?
I think I was there for like 25 days.
Okay. And did you do the aftercare and the IOP afterwards?
Oh, yeah. It's almost like I never left. I went to treatment mainly because I needed to find a way to get off the pain meds. And really what that looked like is just being locked in a room and not being able to drink or drug.
So you had a detox while you were there?
Yeah. It was rough. I didn't have any of the traditional physical symptoms. I was already having the pain.
And they weren't giving you anything for that, were they?
Nope. They gave me Advil or, Toradol or something.
Oh my gosh.
I went, kind of headlong back into the program and it's been that way, ever since. And I'm
So the amount of time between when you went into treatment, which effectively was the last time you drank or used, that you abused medication, let's say.
Correct.
You've had medication since then?
I've not.
You've not, okay. So the end of the drug use, the end of the alcohol happens. How long between that day and your new sobriety date?
That's my new sobriety date.
So you were actually only out there for 5 days?
Yes, something like that. But, I could make the argument that when I was self-prescribing all those meds, I was out there.
Yeah, I get that.
But that's the truth. My mind, wants to say, well, you were only out for 5 days. But the truth is, from a program perspective, the second I started self-prescribing or the second that I became aware that I was self-prescribing and then didn't make a correction, that's when for me, that's how I would say that I went out.
So you were doing that for how long?
Probably about 60 days.
60 days.
I guess, maybe 30.
So really, let's say your real slip was about 60 from the time that you started using irresponsibly, and then you drank, and then you stopped, about 60 days in
Probably, yes, something like that.
So, the thing that strikes me about that, and I saw you a lot during that time, was that you were still doing things around the club. You were like you said, you were still participating.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about compartmentalization. Was that what you were doing when you were in those meetings and that you knew that you were abusing the meds, or did you not see it that way?
I didn't see it that way.
Right, okay.
I saw it as, I need these meds to survive.
Right, okay.
I can't function in life without sleep, and this is how I'm doing it.
Right, so no reason to come clean because you self-justified it.
Self-justified it,
I get it, yeah. But the drinking, the 5 days of drinking was a real stark realization, wasn't it?
Real stark, yeah.
Yeah. So it's almost like it took the drinking to end the drug addiction.
Yeah, and I remember being in treatment and thinking, thank God that this happened to me. Thank God that last doctor said, no more meds.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's amazing.
The addiction takes you to the alcoholism, which then addresses both.
Yeah.
What a great realization. In what ways has your experience with sobriety to begin with, followed by the slip, followed by the new period of sobriety, in what ways have you been able to share that with others, and how have you noticed that impact on them?
I hear anecdotally, from people. I know that the story that I have is not that unique. Mm-hmm. It may be in the sense of how things happen and some nuances, but in general, I remember hearing people in meetings that went out all the time because they had a surgery or something. It's a very common thing. Mm-hmm. And I remember hearing and sitting in meetings and hearing that and going, that sounds crazy that could happen to somebody.
And this is before it happened to you.
Oh, yeah. I remember thinking, how could you not know you're taking meds, alcoholically? How can you not know that?
So in a real sense, you already knew what you ended up denying and then justifying the actual use.
Yeah, because I wasn't taking it to get loaded. I was taking it to alleviate the pain that I had.
Yeah, I get it.
You know, I think what I talk about a lot, or what I think about is just living life on life's terms. Mm-hmm. I've heard you say this, and you know, if you stick around here long enough, life happens to you, good and bad. Yeah, and being able to stay sober through those times is the example that I try to set. As it relates to meds now, you asked me if I had meds. I haven't had any pain meds since then. And our friend, Dan D, I've heard him say this about his own situation, that he's lost the privileges of eating candy. Yeah. And sort of that's how I think about it, is I've lost that privilege. I haven't had to go in, face that again. I'm just focused on today. You know, but that's how I think about pain meds now, is that I've lost the right to have pain meds in the true, you know, sense of true opiates and, you know, narcotics. Right. You know, I'm not saying I don't take Advil or that I wouldn't take aspirin or something of that nature, because I definitely would, but.
Well, you know, it occurs to me too that one of the things that can get us started down that road, like the one you went down with the meds, is that not only do the meds change the way we feel, but when we realize that we have to take more because we're not getting better, that disappointment of it not working, you're dealing with not only the pain, but also the disappointment of having the pain.
For sure.
Like, I had the surgery, I should be feeling better. I'm not. So I'm taking the meds. I'm also really pissed off that I'm not feeling better.
No doubt about it. Yeah. It's a terrible cycle, and was one that I just wasn't aware of. You know, I was aware in the sense that I can understand someone having a surgery, then taking a Vicodin or going, wow, I like the way that made me feel, I'm going to take another one. I understand that conceptually easily. What I didn't understand was this idea that, you know, this effect of needing to take more to make the same amount of pain go away, because the same amount of pain needs more medicine, you know, the more that you use the medicine.
Yeah, it's like what you mentioned earlier about it causing its own pain.
It's very troubling, you know, to think about. And certainly as an addict, you know, I have no business being anywhere near that.
And what great experience that you have now to share with others, because you and I know, especially in that meeting that we go to all the time, that there are people coming in who we can see in legitimate pain. They're limping in, they're in wheelchairs coming in. You know, you can tell just by the way that they're moving that they're in some pain. I can imagine you have lots of opportunities to share what you went through with some of those.
Definitely. Yeah, I continue to look forward to those times.
And that's such a gift. That. I mean, you know, you probably may not see it yourself, but I see it every time I see you talking to one of those people. I'm thinking, man, what a gift that guy is for that person. Yeah. And I've also realized that you are available to be a sponsor and that you've had some experience in doing that. Yeah. And that's a gift.
It is a huge gift, yeah.
Tell me about a couple of gifts that have occurred.
I think the biggest gift, the thing that I've realized, before I got sober in 17, I thought, I used to sit at a bar, or I would just sit with a drink in my hand and think, if God really wants me to stop drinking, he'll strike this drink from my hand. You know? And I think much like having the gift of desperation that I got just by grace, I also have this gift of understanding that that's not how God works. That's not how my God works. The miracle happens when God makes me aware of a problem. He's done his part at that point. And I think understanding that concept that God doesn't make things happen in my life. Things just happen, and I have a responsibility to respond to them. And how I respond to them is up to me. And I think just this from a spiritual aspect, knowing, you know, I used to think, poor me, right. Where's God? And now, because I've been around to see things, that I see God shows up through people. Yeah. You know, I hear God when I go to meetings or when I sit with another alcoholic, you know, and I hear stories and I witness things, you know, that is how my God shows up. But the truth is, I haven't seen a lot of abracadabra activity. Right. You know, now I can look back and say, wow, what in the experiences in my life and some things that have happened to me where I can say, that's God. Yeah. And I do acknowledge that. Yeah. but my perspective is what's shifted. That's the gift I think I'm most grateful for right now.
And that's the kind of gift that can work in so many areas of your life, which is, to me, God expressing himself, giving us the key, and then it's up to us to open the door or not.
That's right.
And that freedom of God's will, it's still God's will for us to have the freedom of self-will, but you've been given the key, you've opened the doors, you know what's behind them, and that, to me, sounds like an incredible gift in your life. And what a blessing for your family to have a sober man at the head of it.
I think so, yeah.
At the end of the day, I think this has just been a beautiful experience for you, huh?
Yeah, it's just tremendous. I'm able to love my children for who they truly are.
Yeah.
And I say it in meetings a lot, they don't owe me anything.
Yeah.
I used to think, you owe me this because I've done this and I've done that. And I don't think like that anymore.
That's an incredible transformation for a parent to have.
It has been great.
And that's a God deal, too.
Totally God.
Right there.
No doubt.
Well, so we've been talking about God. We've been talking about you.
Yeah,
This has been a wonderful, wonderful interview. I just really appreciate the fact that you were willing to sit here today with me and share so much of your life. I feel like I know you so much better now. And I love you, and you're a good man. I respect and admire your journey. And I'm glad I'm able to be there to watch. And to be there with you and to be a resource for you. So
yeah, I love you too, Howard. I appreciate that.
I want to thank you a lot for doing this.
You're very welcome, man. I'm glad to do it.
Well, my friends, that's a wrap for today's episode of AA Recovery Interviews. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed AA Recovery Interviews, will you please tell others how to listen to it? Think of it as a little AA service that spreads the word about this rich and meaningful listening experience. It's yet another helping hand we can all extend to alcoholics everywhere. Visit my website, aarecoveryinterviews.com, where you can listen to every episode of AA Recovery Interviews. And if you want to contact me directly with any comments or suggestions, simply email howard@aarecoveryinterviews.com. By the way, this podcast strictly adheres to AA's 12 traditions and all General Service Office guidelines for safeguarding anonymity online. I pay all production costs, and no one receives financial gain from the show. AA Recovery Interviews and my guests do not speak for or represent AA at large. This podcast is simply my way of giving back to AA that which has been so freely given to me. The next episode of AA Recovery Interviews is on the way, so keep coming back. It'll be here soon.